Hello, everybody. My name is Andy Welkley. I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager here at MRI Software. Really pleased that you're joining us today for our session on global perspectives on workplace agility. The genesis of this session comes from a survey that MRI and CoreNet co-produced, looking at different attitudes around the return to work, around the need for workplace agility as we near the end of the pandemic, hopefully, and we see a return to work, but also the things that need to go into that process. So we were able to survey over 200 tenants and occupiers and nearly 50 landlords, which gives us a unique perspective kind of from both sides of the equation, thinking about how each one needs to consider the process of returning to those spaces. I'm really pleased to be joined today by Sonali Tare. Sonali is the Senior Director of Content Experience from CoreNet. Welcome, Sonali.
Thank you. Very happy to be here. Like Andy said, I'm the Senior Director of Content Experience with CoreNet Global. What that means is I basically lead our content strategy alignment across all of our content distribution channels. I also work on many survey projects like this one that we did with MRI Software. So very happy to be here.
Thank you. We're happy you're here joining us today too. And Brian Zrimzik. Brian is the industry principal at MRI and a participant in the process of evaluating this information. Brian, welcome.
Thanks, Andy. Happy to be here. Some really interesting data we got to share with the audience today.
Yeah, I think it does share some unique perspectives around alignment between the two groups, around the attitudes and perspectives that we're seeing, as well as some gaps that I think we'll explore as well. I think one of the interesting things to start is kind of traditionally in the commercial real estate space, there hasn't been a premium placed on communication. But clearly, with all the variables and all the regulations and all the back and forth that's had to happen to make this process of working through the past year or so productive and successful in as many ways as possible, communication has played a more important role. So let's dig into the numbers a little bit, Brian. I noticed that we've seen a significant increase in the communication between landlords and tenants. What do you attribute that to, do you think?
Well, I think it's a good thing. A lot of tenants, whether it's because they're on the retail side, maybe they were closed. On the office side, they were highly limited in their ability to get to the office, right? Not being essential workers, and maybe just the buildings were closed. Like all those things caused a lot of communication. I think operationally, what's open, what's not open. I think the other side of it is as folks were struggling with lease obligations, wanting to work through those, be in constant contact with the landlord is very important. And I think the other element is that, and we'll see this in the days we go forward, there was some conversations about changing lease obligations over time. So I think there are a lot of reasons to have dialogue because we were in such a non-normal state. It drove kind of an additional layer of communications, which I think is very good and very healthy, because we have to, look, the landlords need the tenants as much as the tenants need the landlords. So we have to work through this together.
Absolutely, we are in all this together. So let's start with kind of the question that's on everybody's mind, and that's the when question. When do we think we're going to get back to something normal, near normal, or even a new normal? So now, what does the data start to tell us?
Sure. Interesting data. What we're seeing here is that over 60% of the respondents are saying that about 1 to 25% of their staff is currently on site. Along the same lines, 65% are saying that about 1 to 25% of their staff is essential. So, it's interesting that I would think that what we're seeing is what we'd assume to be seeing, that not everybody's back on site yet, that people who are back on site are considered essential. And I don't think it's a big surprise what we're seeing. Sort of moving on to,
actually,
when.
One other note there, there is a little surprise in that data, in that when you ask the landlords the same question, if you look at your tenants, what percent of their workforce is on site? So to what you just said, the majority of the respondents on the tenancy side said up to 25% of my workforce is on site. the landlords feel like there's a lot more people on site than the tenants are reporting. So I think this is one of those first little hints where there might be a little more optimism on the landlord side than is what the tenants are reporting. Now, we should say that these tenants aren't necessarily the tenants of these landlords, right? Like the survey's not that good, right? But we do have tenants and landlords. So I think there's just this data skews a bit towards more people being on site from a landlord point of view than what the tenants are reporting, which I find interesting.
So, when it comes to going back to the office, what are we seeing? It looks like end users / occupiers will continue to be cautious. Almost 80% of the respondents said that a small percentage, about 0 to 25% of their workforce, will be back in the office by the end of Q2 this year, which is not that far away. And over 70% are yet to determine how much of their workforce will be back by the end of Q4 2021. So it looks like people are still making up their minds about how their employees will go back, what the future will look like. Brian, any thoughts there?
Well, yeah, I mean, the biggest thought I think is that that's okay. Like look, there's going to be optimists and there's going to be pessimists, and you see both of those in the data. And then there's people that are unsure, and that's okay, right? We're still in the midst of, the vaccine rollout, right? We don't know what, variant issues might pop up, right? There's all kind of unknowns. And I think, people have to kind of step into this and do what's right for their organization. So I wouldn't judge anybody by this. I think it's relatively common. The thing that this does tell me is that it kind of leans a little later in the year than earlier in the year, right? Kind of the majority are saying kind of Q4, not Q2, which I think holds, like, if you think about the natural calendar of things, like, let's get back to the school year, let's get past Labor Day in North America, right? That's when, more kind of common infrastructure for like childcare is in place. And maybe that lets us have more normalcy in the office.
Yeah, that's, those great points there. And I like the fact that you're saying we should not judge.
Landlords report on the same data. Again, they're a bit more optimistic. And actually, if we go to the next view, we can see the two charts stacked on top of each other. So you can see how on the top chart, which is the occupiers, the density of the chart is to the right of the slide, whereas the landlord, it's a bit more smoothed out. So the landlords feel like there's more folks coming back sooner. So again, a little disconnect. I think it goes to maybe a lot of those conversations weren't about when people were coming back to the office. They were about, operational and leasing things that needed to be talked about in the moment. And so I think there's opportunities to kind of connect these dots. So yeah, more optimist landlords and maybe more realist tenants.
Yeah, and that was an interesting first kind of gap that we saw as they reported that communication had been increasing, but clearly some of that communication, Brian, as you pointed out, and Sonali as well, isn't necessarily maybe about the timing quite as accurately. And I like the word optimistic. Hopefully we all can kind of trend toward that mean of being optimists together. I want to pivot a little bit. And, we're talking about the return to work, but that definitely implies that a lot of people are not in the office setting and they're working remotely. And there's been a lot written about how to facilitate that and how to give people the engagement tools to do their jobs productively. And what I find interesting here is, that debate had been raging for a long time about the relative ability for people to work from home or the productivity they might have. And it's funny, as recently as January 2020, the Social Security Administration put out a memo that said, now's not the time for a big experiment for working from home. A couple months later, Forbes wrote an article that said the pandemic has launched a grand experiment from working from home. So in the space of just a couple months, a debate that was kind of academic at that point, people were writing about it, talking about it, really became our reality. And so we learned a lot about it. We did ask about it in this survey. So Sonali, maybe you could walk us through some of the results that we got about the impact of remote work.
Sure, and what you're saying, Andy, is so true. I think all the skeptics, everyone who was saying no, kind of was really forced into it. I don't think many had a choice about how we move forward, when the when the pandemic first hit. So, and that sort of bears itself out in the data we're seeing. So, we've been assuming since the pandemic started that remote working that we've been doing for the past year is going to be around for a longer time. And that is what we're seeing. So approximately 65% say that they already had remote working available for employees before the pandemic. But post-pandemic, we're seeing that number rise to almost 90%. You're still seeing some people who are saying, that there isn't going to be any remote working post the pandemic either. But it is an interesting data set that we're seeing a good 25% jump in those who are saying that they had remote working before and they have remote working after. Brian, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, just to add, if you dig into that data a bit vertically, and it should be no surprise, professional services, business services, financial services are the three areas that a lot of respondents to the survey, as well as highly favorable in this, so had it and are adding to it. And we'll see some of the impacts of that as we go through some of the other data. So, where some more traditional industries, maybe they're a bit more traditional. Traditional from I deliver my services where I work as opposed to from where I work.
And then, that sort of plays really well into this next slide that we're looking at, which is, of course, that not everybody will be able to continue remote working. And we already saw that, earlier in the slide deck, that some people are already back in the office, and there's always going to be and always have been essential workers who have had to be in their work spaces on site doing their jobs. So what we're seeing here is that almost 60% say that there will be a policy in place that allows some to work remotely, while the rest will have to still come into the office. There's a small percentage, and I want to say it was just a little over 1%, that are currently looking at a completely virtual or a completely remote situation for their employees.
Yeah, and that makes sense. We believe very strongly that every company needs a physical footprint. You need a place to build culture. You need a place for touchstone. You need some collaborative space and something that you can recognize as yours. And yeah, it doesn't have to be 8 to 5, 5 days a week, populated with everybody, right? There's an alternative that we've all learned about over the last year plus, that there's the old research about how many days it takes to form a new habit. Well, we're well beyond whatever any of those studies say at this point, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. And, there is something to be said for the fact that everyone has, from what I've heard, has been working productively from home. And they're also used to the flexibility that working from home gives. Some might want that, some might not want that, but I think it's great that looking at the previous slide where there is an increase in those who will allow for remote working, that is taken into consideration, that there might be a higher demand or desire from the employees for continued flexible working or remote working.
We asked the landlords, do you think there's an impact on your business due to remote work? I'm fascinated by this. 70% said no. We just saw the tenants say, we're moving to more remote work. And the landlord said, I don't think it's going to affect my business, which, that it may be the optimist view. It also may be reality in that, there is finite space. The economy is going to continue to grow, and they'll find new tenants if there's, if enough big pieces of space free up, as opposed to, as we'll see in a bit, people needing more space per person in the footprint they have. So you might have less people in the office, but the same amount of office, as an example. So
yeah,
kind of interesting. Go ahead.
And we are seeing, some big tech companies are adding space. It's not that we're seeing just cutting off space. So perhaps there's some reason for the optimism. But it's interesting that there's that diversity in that viewpoint.
I was on a panel not too long ago, and one of the other panelists, I'll steal his line, we were talking about the idea of, all the news about the exodus from cities and things moving, and he said, let's focus on headcount, not headlines, right? So even though some
Yeah.
companies' headquarters might move from, Silicon Valley to Austin, Texas or something, it doesn't mean all the people did,
Yeah.
right? So, let's focus. I thought that was a really insightful way to think of it. Let's look at the headcount that changed.
So here we're sort of looking at exactly what we just started talking about, forecasted space needs, and how that might change. So given the data we've seen thus far, it's not really that surprising that over 50% of respondents are saying that they might lease less space based on the need for fewer employees to be on site or in their offices. But on the flip side, the landlord side isn't necessarily seeing that perspective, with just over 30% saying that tenants won't make or won't need to make substantial changes, as compared to just 15% of end users saying the same. So there is a little bit of disconnect there as well.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, neither camp report much in the way of needing more space, which, if you think about the likelihood of economic growth and expansion as we return and everything opens back up again, you'd think there might be some people forecasting growth. That may just be offset with not the very first thing on here, right? Fewer employees on site. I don't need as much space, right? So I think the combination of those two things, right? Maybe I keep the space I have and I grow into it with less density, right? Or I don't see as much growth and I can just change the density. So yeah, but again, that little bit of a disconnect here for those landlords. And again, from the landlord point of view, we ask them, what have you seen your tenants doing? And these are the same people that said, I don't see an impact on my business at a 70% rate, right? Well, they're negotiating new leases, they're breaking leases, they're negotiating shorter terms, they're leasing less space. Like all those feel like things that might impact your business a little bit. So I find it really fascinating. And again, maybe that question was just viewed differently, or maybe in a longer horizon than this one. This is kind of what's going on in the moment. And I think, there's a lot of truth here. A lot of organizations have assessed what their real estate needs are. And because we have found success at working from home, that maybe those small satellite offices aren't as necessary as we thought they were. And I can use, more space as a service, right? I can use the Regis, the WeWork, all those kind of flexible bookings to kind of facilitate the same outcome for me as a company without necessarily signing up for a lease that's, multi-year for a space.
Yeah, that's a great point.
As we've worked through some of the data, I think as we all prepared for it, we noticed that there was even more kind of under the surface here. What we wanted to do in this session was really highlight some of the real compelling things that we found. But I just want to remind everybody, we will actually be diving deeper into the data and publishing a report, a little longer form that gives us the ability to go in and really look at some of the details here. So keep your eyes open. There's more goodness here from this data and from the survey results that we're able to get. But we're really pleased to be able to share some of this that we found right off the top. So let's transition here a little bit. One of the things that I think we can all be confident in is the people that left the office setting in March are not the same people that are going to be coming back. They've been shaped by different expectations, different experiences, and so there is, a different set of needs and expectations that they're going to have on the way back in. Sonali, what did some of the participants in the survey share about their approach to getting back into the office?
Sure. So, we saw in the earlier slides that there will be more remote working. That seems to be a given. But there doesn't seem to be as much of a push towards a formal policy, which might allocate certain days that an employee needs to be in or out of the office or things like that. So what we're seeing is, over 40% are saying that there won't be a formal policy, which is interesting.
Yeah, I do find that a bit fascinating. I don't know that it's wise to try to leave it to chance, right? there has to be some guideline. Maybe policy is too strong, but teams need to be together to collaborate. So you need to figure out how to make that happen. And especially if you're expecting less people, you can't have everybody not in the office on Mondays and Fridays, as an example, right? And everybody vying for the conference rooms on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. So you got to figure that out, quite simply. And I think the next slide actually digs a little deeper, and it's kind of interesting when, what expectations might there be from, like kind of come in whenever you want to, right? Which is, aside from not sure, the second highest, response here. But, there's a good population of responses at 3 to 4 times a week, at 1 to 2 times a week, or, so it's really random. And, I think if we were to ask this question of people in a year, I bet we'll see a bit more organization than we see today in the data.
And I wonder if this sort of ties back to, one of those initial slides we saw about end users just not being sure about when they will go back. And,
Absolutely.
I wonder if that's sort of being played out over most of these slides, that the fact that they're still unsure about that basic fact sort of just bleeds into everything else. So, we've talked about, will there be a policy, how many times, things like that. And that's going to also play into how much space is needed, what kind of space is needed. So we are seeing that there will be more hot desking offered, with over 50% saying, of the respondents saying that that will be the case. And we have just under 20% saying that they will be keeping assigned workstations, which I also find interesting from, sort of the pandemic point of view, where we've seen there might be more space between workstations, plexiglass, things like that. And I want to say that we have another slide that talks about that later on too.
We do.
Yeah.
The thing that I think is interesting here is that, some already had hot desking and that expands. And one of the complexities with hot desking is having some technology to help manage that, right? So I think there's and we'll see this later when we talk about technology adoption, but this is probably one of the areas that's going to drive some new things. If more than half the respondents are just introducing hot desking, they're going to be looking for, how do I do that effectively, right? From a mobile device, and really kind of put people in the areas together where they need to be together, to use maybe a bad analogy, so that the zoo is divided up by animals, right? You don't have an accountant sitting next to a salesperson and then a support person next to them and a developer next to them. Like, the developers are together and the accountants are together and the salespeople are together in their segments, of the office. So you can't just be random assignment. It needs to be managed appropriately, and technology can definitely help with that.
Yeah, that's a great point about sort of keeping some of the teams together in terms of collaboration as well.
So interestingly, we asked if occupants are planning to make changes, and to what you just said, right? There are a number of things that we talked about, maybe more space with more defined areas, barriers in between, more breakout rooms, bigger conference rooms, all those things you would expect if you just take the lens of what would I do to my office to help with social distancing, and you made a list, it would be this, right? Makes perfect sense. What's interesting though, is that we go to the next slide, that the landlords haven't heard from their tenants about making changes to the space. So either, again, we're not communicating on the right things, or the tenants are still in planning mode, and because we still have maybe 6 months until they're coming back to the office, they haven't really yet engaged the landlord in the conversation, and they should, and they need to, and they should, to the extent that they need to. So not all reconfigurations of space require the landlord, right? So that's, that could explain that a bit well, but I do find it interesting that, almost 80% of the landlords said, yeah, nobody's talked to us about reconfiguring the space. So that was kind of interesting. And actually the last, I think, slide in this segment is also from the landlord point of view. And I find this very reassuring. If you're from a landlord point of view and you say, what should we be doing, through that same lens? If I made a list of all the things I might do and areas of my buildings that I control, where maybe social distancing and just hygiene and those things, like I think you'd come up with this list, right? Let's work on the elevator etiquette, right? Let's modify common areas, right? Let's change the lobby, right? So again, and landlords are taking these actions today, right? So I think, it's in both cases, people are doing what I think the common person would expect them to do to facilitate getting back to the office, right? So we're all more comfortable, right, when we go there, because we've all been in situations where you're in a office building lobby at 8:05 a.m. and you're cramming into those elevators, and that's just probably not going to be as comfortable for folks, right, today. So it's good to see that there's some attention being paid to these things.
And you're so right about that. I remember speaking to an FM leader recently, and they emphasized the comfort and the experience point of view of the employee, and the fact that if the employee isn't comfortable going back into the space, if they're not happy being where they are, they're not going to be productive. So you can want your people back, really want them back, but if they're not okay being there, it's going to impact how productive they are and how well they do being back in the workspace. So I think this sort of feeds into that as well. I think, from the landlord's perspective, having, giving some of that comfort that might allow their tenants to bring back their employees.
Yeah. There's a lot of dimensions to this specific problem, especially around lobbies of high-rise buildings. People come to work. Let's say that the staff it isn't quite as organized as be there at 8 a.m., right? There's a ramp up, and at the end of the day, there's a ramp down. People come in a little earlier and they leave a little earlier, later and later, but the lunch hour is a bit more organized. So, we have to all figure out how to manage the inflow and outflow of all the people from the building, and visitors as well, right? Like there's a whole nother layer of coordination, again, just, to keep people comfortable, right? How do we best do that? So I think there's still a lot of learnings to be had as we get back to the office. And again, technology can help with some of these things. And I think that our last topic is going to be about technology adoption.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, you're right, Brian. That is kind of our last topic today. And I think one of the things that I've heard in the discussion today is that there's still a fair amount of uncertainty out there. There's still a lot of development that has to happen in habits and approaches and experiences as people do come back to work. It may change over time. The initial return may look very different from what it's like 6, 9, 12 months down the road. And so we need a way to kind of enhance that comfort for people to feel good about coming back, to reduce some of the friction in the process, whether it's in the lobby or whether it's finding what desk to go to on your 2 days in the office, or even the ability to measure all those different things so that we can adapt and be agile and flexible as those habits and as those experiences emerge. So, Sonali, what did the data tell us a little bit about attitudes toward technology here?
Sure. And, I think there's no surprise that there will be some increased or significant increase in use of technology as end users as well as occupiers navigate, what's going on right now, how their space needs are evolving, what they might need to keep an eye on for the future. So we can see a high number of respondents, over 80%, saying that they will adopt new technology, while almost 80% are saying that they will expand the use of existing tools. So like I said, no doubt that is going to change. And then, how it's used is going to be interesting as well. Like Brian said a little bit earlier, as it relates to hot desking, or is it from the perspective of the landlord in terms of how they manage some of the common spaces in their buildings and in their in their buildings. Brian, what are your thoughts?
I totally agree, and I think the next slide shows the landlord view of this. And equally, the landlords are going to adopt more new or expand the use of technology. So I think, if there's one silver lining in the pandemic, it's this. It's the accelerated adoption of technology. because we needed to do so many things remotely. We turned to technology to do it. And that adoption typically is a one-way street. We typically don't put technology back down again once we've adopted it. So, you know, I think it's, I was actually a little surprised by this stat that there was so much additional adoption, but, you know, as opposed to expansion. But it's, I think, encouraging that, look, you know, we can use technology to bridge a lot of these activities, you know, to make, like, we talk about the idea of hot desking, or visitor management, right? Like, visitor management's interesting, especially when you get into a, you know, a tower situation, because the landlord's typically managing the lobby, but each firm is typically managing their own space, right? So there's multiple layers to that, and I think there's, you know, it's one of the things that, you know, there are plenty of ways to apply technology to help with those processes today. So we'll see a lot more of this adoption as we go forward.